Okay. We're rolling. We're rolling. Don't anyone get too intimidated. Okay. Could you state your name for the record?
Sure. Jason Nicholas Vasser.
Nice. I didn't know that was your middle name.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
So I think just to get us started, if you could talk to us at all about like your own writing or any language practices, how you see that connected to, I don't know, in an email you wrote to me, you said that you study the self through creative works, and I thought that was really interesting. So I wonder if you could just tell us more about what that means to you, how you see your use of language connected to yourself and things like that, because that's a lot of the stuff that comes up a lot, time and time again in the scholarship we're reading in this class.
Sure. It's really it's cyclical because I first started writing poetry when I was in middle school. I went to Visual Performing Arts at Marquette Middle School, and my parents were going through a divorce at the time, and so I really needed an outlet. And my English teacher brought in some Langston Hughes and some other poetry, and I really kind of enjoyed reading poetry. You know, I enjoyed that whole thing of poetry, and so as a youngster, I was really into the literature of poetry, and it was self. It was all about me trying to make sense of my little world, you know. And then it became more, the personal really was political. I mean, that's a gender studies theory. But for me, the personal was really political because as I got older, I found that my poetry was really a voice, a mechanism that I can use to convey messages in a non-threatening way. It's very difficult to express oneself when you don't have the words. But when you are introduced to metaphor, it makes it easier to convey messages. And so I was able to use the craft of poetry to express myself in ways that otherwise would not have been able to do. When I first started doing poetry as an adult, I was doing spoken word poetry, as I call it. And a lot of the poetry I did was very angry. It was very against the system. But I found that yelling and screaming wasn't the answer. And so I needed to find a different way to create my art in a way that was constructive. And so I wanted to do an MFA in part because I wanted to learn the craft of poetry that can appeal to all audiences. Because it didn't make sense to preach to the choir. It made more sense to talk to people who, you know, didn't look like me as well, right? And so I used my poetry to express myself even as an adult. And when Ferguson happened, it was such a moment because you read about the civil rights movement, and you read about the Harlem Renaissance, and you read about different movements in history, but you never get to live a moment for yourself. So Ferguson was that moment for me where I was able to live an historical moment. I went to McClure High School right up the street, and James Knowles, the mayor of Ferguson, we were on the wrestling team together. So all these people that I interacted with or that I was speaking to in the work, I knew on a personal level. And so it became really interesting and political for me to write poetry towards an issue that I really didn't have the words to express, but through poetry I was able to express them.
I'm really interested in sort of like what you said about audience, because obviously audience comes up a lot when you're studying rhetoric, and you see poetry as like kind of allowing you a way to connect with some audiences that you weren't connecting to otherwise, and sometimes you said sometimes you felt like your words were too angry to reach certain audiences.
Absolutely, because I came from a place of, I would do poetry from a place of anger. I was, confused. I was, everything a young person would be when faced with opposition or racism or anything like that. They want to yell and they want to do something to fight back. And so I would fight back with my words. But I found that version of fighting wasn't conducive. It wasn't doing anything than making me look like this angry man screaming from the top of a mountain when no one can hear what I was saying on the ground. So
that's really interesting. Does that connect with, like, in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch article about poetry, they talked about poetry as healing in kind of a post-Ferguson era. Does that connect with kind of your conceptions of, and I know that you have an interest in writing and healing and that sort of thing too.
It does. Writing and healing for me takes part in, because poetry is a, as I said earlier, it's about the self. You write what you're obsessed about. And so you write about what it is, and then you find a way to read poetry or share poetry that people can appreciate. So I would write a version for myself and then concoct a version that I think my readership will be able to digest. And in that way, I'm able to have people understand what I'm saying. And sometimes it's unfair. Like I'm in the process now of I don't want to be a black writer anymore. I want to be a writer. And so a lot of the stuff I've been doing in my early writing career was I was writing as a black writer. You can tell, like I was writing as a black writer. But, even in that, the personal becomes political because now you ostracize a whole group of people who would want to listen to your work or read your work, but you leave them outside because they don't have that experience. And so I'm trying to, again, concoct versions of my work where my readership can appreciate it on both sides. People in the hood can read it and get something from it, and people in the suburbs can read it and appreciate it. And, and it becomes a living art versus something that only lives in a certain sphere.
That seems so hard, like this notion of getting away, and it's probably something you're just working on, so maybe this question is like too difficult. But what does it mean, I guess, or if you could tell us more about that idea of moving from a black writer to just being seen as a writer.
Sure.
And why that's something because it would seem to me when I think about Ferguson, it's like, well, I want like identity is so central, so I want race to be part of the discussion, for instance, but I don't know, I'm speaking from like a white female subject position, which is obviously different than yours. So I don't know, what does it tell me more about this notion of moving from being a black writer to being a writer? It seems like it has something to do with readership and audience, for sure.
It has a lot to do with readership, but it also has to do with history, because there was a time when it was illegal for black people to read and write. And so now that we can read and write, we're using our voices to speak towards issues that we've had to deal with for so long. And it's not even a situation of even slavery or, the bus boycotts. I'm in a generation, I was born in 1978, but I was still called nigger. I was still up against certain monsters that I had to deal with when I went to bed at night. And so I'm not even talking from a perspective of, I never picked cotton before. My grandmother made me pick it, but I was never forced to pick cotton as my grandmother had, But I know what that feels like. Or I was never told to sit at the back of the bus, but I know what it's like to take public transportation and hear the conversations of people who are just so, they don't really understand what they're saying. They have these conversations, and it's almost as if they're the Klan talking about these people, And so it's interesting because I don't want my audience to read my work and say, well, this is a black writer and he's only speaking from a black experience. Slavery was an American experience. And so I had to write from a perspective that everyone can appreciate versus just a select few. And that's the challenge. James Baldwin had to move to Paris to become a writer. In America, he was a black writer. So I had to, it's hard, but it's almost that it becomes more political to be just a writer, because now, even though I'm African, so of course my work is going to reflect what I am, but at the same time, that isn't all that I am. My experience is someone of a different, ethnicity can share some same experiences, and so I want to write towards what that is. How can we get past the notion of difference and get to the notion of a shared experience? And that's the challenge for me as a writer.
Do you have a question, Melody? And I can open this up. Everybody, please feel like you can ask. I wanted to throw out a few example type questions, but jump in.
Do you feel like you're writing toward intersectionality or trying to bring that in? Do you publish both versions of your poems, or is that a metaphorical?
It just really depends on the magazine. There's a magazine out of Texas, Callaloo, which is basically publishes African American authors, and so that's an audience for something that would be, more independent. Rather if I write for the Crab Orchard Review in Carbondale, I want that to be more something, where the readership is broader. So it really depends on who I'm writing for. I've had to, one of my professors in the MFA program, Shane Seeley, would have me do is write a black version and write a regular version. And that way I still have both versions to share, while at the same time I can do things with both of them independently for different audiences.
I was just saying, I think with Anne's Aldua especially, it comes up like speaking different languages, and I mean, although hers is Spanish, I would say that I couldn't understand necessarily everything you have to say, but that I think personally I don't know, like I'm just trying to figure out, because as a reader, I think I would rather hear your authentic voice rather than what you were trying to say for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I totally understand what you're doing and respect that. I mean, I'm hopefully a writer at some point too, but I just think it's a complicated existence.
Mm-hmm. It is, and that's the line. Because when you read it, I do want you to get that experience, but I don't want to beat you over the head with it, being, Viva la Revolution. It doesn't have to be that heavy for it to be a powerful piece of poetry or a piece of writing.
And it seems like you made this mention of sort of how you don't want people to say, well, I'm not going to read this black writer because I'm not black. It's not my experience. And it kind of reminds me of, we had a discussion the other day looking at those magazine covers briefly from Ferguson, and how like sometimes if it, like I like when clearly people want to bring race into discussion of Ferguson because it is an event about race, but then sometimes it can become like overly localized where the rest of the nation gets to just say, oh, I washed my hands of it because we're not Ferguson. So there's this like line to walk of somehow addressing these issues of identity and race and difference, but also understanding that these problems are not just one city or one person, or I don't
Absolutely.
know. Something resonating with me.
I have a friend in Maryland, and he and I talk quite often. He would ask me, he'd say, now, how far is Ferguson from St. Louis? And I say, it's part of St. Louis. It's one of our municipalities, and yada, yada, yada. But what I found interesting is the whole I Heart Ferguson thing, or Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter thing. That rhetoric is very interesting. It's very interesting if you really pay attention, because, okay, when police shoot people or when police do things, they're doing it in the name of the state. The state does these things. The state, crack down on drugs or whatever, right? And so when the state kills a child, even though he may be a big child or maybe an angry child, he's still a child. So when the state kills this person, now all of a sudden we love Ferguson. When before we didn't have to say we love Ferguson. I have to question what that really means. Are you loving the Ferguson that kills people? Or are you loving the Ferguson before all this happened? It's a gray area. And then when you have this situation where Black Lives Matter, of course Black Lives Matter, but we have this whole group of people who want to say all lives matter. And we know all lives matter. But it only becomes, an issue when black bodies are being discarded as if they don't matter. So now you have two people having the same conversation of ignorance. It's like, of course all lives matter. But when it comes to us, we don't matter. And so what do you do with that? Right? And that's, again, the line I walk in my work, is how to convey that in a way that isn't threatening. That's the challenge of a writer, is how to convey that message without being the angry black man in the room. I've always been the angry black man in the room. In workshop, in a poetry reading. I've always had to speak for a whole group of people when I'm just one person. And in a sense, that isn't fair. But I'm always looked at as the expert because this is who I am. Yeah. And so think about how it would be if you were put on the spot and had to speak for your generation or your culture or your ethnicity. All the men who have on gray hoodies today, you have to speak for all those gentlemen. Regardless of what they may do or not do, you have to speak for all those people. And that isn't fair to you. But when writing becomes a mechanism for, again, political or personal or whatever, I have to wear the hoodie. I have to be the one speaking for these people, if I want to or not.
Resonates with a lot of the reading. We just read Linda Alcoff's The Problem of Speaking for Others, which addresses some of the same issues that you're talking about, having to be a spokesperson versus when you need to step back, be a listener, and what even delineates a group in terms of who can speak for who. Sort of some of the, you have training in anthropology as well.
Yes.
So some of those kind of interesting problems that ethnographers might face when they're writing about certain populations and how they might represent them. Evan, did you have a question at some point? I feel like your hand. I don't know. I felt like
It
someone.
wasn't really a question.
Okay.
I was just going to add something.
Yeah.
I think about Aladina saying, I want to hear your authentic voice, and so would I, but that's us.
Right.
So the people he's changing it for are not us. He's changing it for the people who do say, I'm not going to read that because I'm not black. So, yeah.
That's a good point too.
Are you afraid that maybe because I know when Ferguson was happening, it was everywhere, and the national discussion was about Ferguson and police brutality and Eric Garner, and so it continued on. But are you afraid of that it's going to fade, and that we're just going to sort of not, how we sort of people are into something when it happens, and then they sort of move on and they don't worry about it anymore. You afraid that Ferguson might fade away and we're going to forget until another black gentleman is killed again?
Yes and no. I mean, I think it's going to fade. I think people are going to eventually stop talking about Ferguson, but then it'll be something else to talk about. And so it becomes a larger issue of what St. Louis is doing. Because people forget Ferguson is St. Louis. It's not like even St. Genevieve is near St. Louis. And so it's not like it's Nebraska. This is happening in our hometown. And it's affecting our hometown. And so I think it ought to be a conversation where I think it should shift. I think the conversation should shift from what we've been talking about and shift to what we can do to make change, to make positive change, to bring people together over something, even if it's a beer. Just bring people together. And then that way, we can start to talk about other things. We can start healing beyond Ferguson. Yes.
So what do you think about these more national movements? I saw you speak at the Black Poets Speak event.
Yes.
And I thought that was a St. Louis thing, but it's actually a national thing. And of course, using your voice, obviously, I'm sure the audience, you felt the responsibility too to speak, to read your poetry. How do you feel about that actually? Because it is a larger thing. When I looked at their Tumblr, it's awesome, that they are doing that in cities around. So, how do you feel about that then? Because I think in a way it has shifted, right?
Yes.
People kind of...
I think it's a wonderful thing. Art changes lives. I think, and it sounds quirky and it sounds, yada, 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 but art changes lives. And that ought to be one of the solutions. We need to have more artistic movements that speak towards these issues, because in those movements, in those artistic spaces, we become just people, just St. Louisans. And that's the beauty of it, is that we can just be people and not worry about all this other stuff when we're doing art, when we're engaged with one another doing something other than being burdened with the obvious, right?
A question, you said you had questioned the message behind I Heart Ferguson.
Yeah.
And I was also wondering about how do you question rhetorically, I'm saying question rhetorically, the message behind healing for St. Louis? Because that could be interpreted a lot of different ways.
It could. And, it just really depends on who's making the statement.
Mm-hmm.
It really just depends on who's making that statement. And it's difficult because we live in this area, And before Ferguson happened, before all this happened, it wasn't an issue. We would go to court or we go to the brew house and people would have a good time together. But now we have to pay attention to Ferguson. We know we're in Ferguson now.
Mm-hmm.
We see the murals on the walls. We see everything that's happening in response to what's happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it becomes an issue of who's saying this or who's saying that.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a woman, when I would come home from class, there was a woman who had a Confederate flag on her pickup truck. And she also had a I Love Ferguson tag on her car. And so it's it really boils down to who's saying it and what does that mean when they say that.
Yeah. Because to me, I was wondering, tying back to what he was saying about healing for St. Louis, kind of maybe meaning let's stop talking about it.
It could be construed that way.
Kind of worrisome.
It could be construed that way, but again, people are really trying. I do see people trying to make change, and and that's the good thing. But it may come off like that, like they're trying to push it But that's what they should do is push it. Let's do more. Let's keep, even if it's fake. Let's just get together and smile and just forget about this for a while, even for a moment. Because when you do that, eventually the smiles become real. I met a guy at the brew house who had never spoken to me before Ferguson, and I still went to the brew house, to have the Jubilee. And so I would go and have my little pint, and he would talk. He came over and said, "Hey, you're a poet." I said, "Yeah." He said, "So what do you think about this Ferguson?" He said, "Never mind. Never mind. Let me buy you a beer." And he had never spoken to me, a day in life. But now all of a sudden, he wants to buy me a beer. And so we chopped it up for a good 35, 45 minutes. And that was it. And I haven't seen him since at the brew house. But for that moment, it didn't matter.
Other questions for Jason or comments at all?
Do you have a personal routine that you hold yourself for writing? Or how do you approach that?
I write a little bit every day. Typically it's a poem. I'm working on a short story right now too. So I write a little bit on my short story, then I write a poem, I'll take a break, then I'll go back to it, write a little bit from the short story, write a poem, and then I'm done. Then the next day I'll go back and edit it, and then I'll go and write something new the next day. And when I'm in a writer's block, I do ekphrastic reading. I'll pick up a magazine or look up an image on the internet. I'll go to the art museum or any one of our beautiful museums or places here in St. Louis and write about what I see. I pick up a book of photos. I have all these books at home of different photos from back in the day, and I'll look at it, just thumb through a photo and just create a story based on that photo. So I'm always engaged with the writing.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
I need to do that.
Yeah. Right.
I know that when I was here before, you and I worked a little bit for the program. Did you create writing in the schools? Was that yours?
No. I was the coordinator for Writers in the Schools. The Writers in the Schools program is out of our MFA program, and what it is, it's an opportunity for MFA students to get teaching experience working with high school students. But I was fortunate enough to serve as coordinator for a year and a half.
Do you think that as people who have sort of infiltrated this the social construction of knowledge here in the university setting, we should take that out to communities who don't have access?
Absolutely.
Because there's the rhetorical sort of what are we trying to teach people or individuals that we're getting from here? Because it's obviously even if we only talk about race, then it's it's mostly white. This is, if you want to be a better writer, let me give you the Webster dictionary so that you can learn the language of old white men to succeed. And so, but doesn't that become problematic?
No, because we live in the U.S. And even though I speak English, I teach English at home, I speak a different version of English because I'm an African person. And so I have to stay true to that language. If your family is from Germany, by all means, speak German as much as you can. Because once you forget the language, you forget part of yourself. But you also have to live in this country and succeed in this country, and you have to speak the King's English. My father would always tell me, you have to learn how to speak the King's English. And what that means is you have to go on an interview and sound like they sound. You can't sound like you're talking to one of your homeboys on the block, or you can't speak Gomala or Swahili. You have to speak their language. And in that respect, you become one of them. And so I teach my students every day. We have a word of the day. We'll do a vocabulary word and we'll use it in a sentence. The first word we learn was didactic because it's, learning, it's designed to teach or learn something, from the writing. And so I said, this is what you're going to be doing all semester, didactic writing. And so every day they have a different word, and they like it now because they're using it in sentences, they're speaking to one another, and they're using these words. And I tell them, the reason you're using these words is because they use these words. They being the people who have the jobs that you want. They use these words. So you use these words. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, Rachel.
Okay, so my brother teaches fourth grade in New York, and that time is like really crucial for reading and writing. So, what are some of the challenges that you see your students face, and what are ways that you can, teachers who work with kids at a young age can work on those challenges so they don't have quite such a hard transition from grade school to college?
Reading. Reading is by far the best thing you can teach a student to do. And because once they learn how to read, they become interested in reading, and they find authors that they like, and then they have stuff to add to the conversation. You know, it would be so cool. My nephew is 8, but it would be so interesting. And I know he's into video games and yada yada. But if he would sit amongst his friends and talk about Dr. Seuss, I would be so impressed because you're analyzing what you're reading. And that's what people want you to do in college and beyond, is analyze what you read and what you interpret the world. Don't just look at the world, interpret the world. And so I think what your brother should do is really focus on reading. My students don't read. If I say read, sometimes the articles are like a page long, and they don't read them.
Yeah.
I have to bring in something that's interesting for them to read it. That's not in the textbook. But I just say that to say, reading is by far the best thing you can give a student.
And it seems like by the time they get to college sometimes they've been beaten down a little bit by texts that they just couldn't access for various reasons. Like that, just felt inaccessible to them. I don't know. You just read so many stories about people who hate reading and they really hate writing.
There's so many people that say, I hate reading.
Yeah.
Like, you read every day of your life. It's literally every day of your life. You go online and look up articles constantly. Why are you telling me you hate reading?
So how do we find ways to integrate the reading? You are reading, and it's hard because writing is I find even worse with students.
Yeah.
They're so terrified.
They are.
Because they've only experienced this version of writing that's been really, really corrective, especially students that might be speaking African American vernacular English or might be an ESL student.
Mm-hmm.
These people have only experienced the deep red pen treatment when they're writing, and there's a lot of fear, which I totally get because I feel really afraid about writing.
I hated reading when I was a child because I was reading things that didn't interest me.
Mm-hmm.
But when someone gave me something when that teacher gave me Langston Hughes, I got hooked.
Yeah.
And I kept at it, And so sometimes it's a matter of having a child do something to read, even if they don't want to read, so they can figure out what they do like.
Mm-hmm.
And then once they figure that part out, then you can just stay in that genre, even.
And he tries, and it's so hard because he teaches in a rural area, and we're from a rural area, so there are a lot of correlation between urban schools and rural schools in the way that they're poverty stricken and don't have the same access to books and technology.
What I would do is I would have the students write their own stories and have them read those. Have them make a chapbook, even if they staple them together, and then have the students read those stories. And then they can even workshop them or kind of hear the voice of the author in the classroom, and they can have a dialogue about it. And if they do that type of thing, they'll be more interested because it's their work versus somebody else.
Jason, I'm going to give you the last word here. I think you've touched on so many of these things that have come up in this class already. Is there anything else you want to tell us about your teaching, your poetry, your civic engagement, anything else we need to know?
Sure. And I hope I filtered all your questions. I mean, if you have more, you can email me. I can give you my email address at the end of this. But I think no one becomes civically engaged because they want to be. I think they become civically engaged because there is no other choice. They see a need and they meet that need. And it takes a certain type of person to want to do that. And I want to do that. I've always been involved on campus and otherwise, but there's something about this city. I love St. Louis. And what breaks my heart is the reality that St. Louis has so far to go. And so for me, it's fulfilling to do civically engaged activities. Like I sit on the board at the St. Louis Poetry Center. I'm surrounded by people who are white men and women who have taught English for thousands of years. They're old people, but they're lovely people, and they're trying to reach out and trying to connect. They're trying to do something with the time they have left to connect their community, and that brought me in to help do that. And so I said, whatever you need me to do, that's what will happen, because I do see the passion in their faces, as you can probably see the passion in my face, in regards to giving back to our community, right? I don't know what else I can say. My teaching, I teach the way I want to be taught. I teach the way that I take bits and pieces of professors I've admired, like Professor Obermark and people in my MFA program. I use the skills that they use in my teaching because it's something clicked in me when they did certain things, right? So pay attention to your teachers. If you want to be in education, pay attention to your teachers and pick up things that they do that you may want to use. What else? In my writing, again, it's based on life, not just my life, but the lives I see, the things I see in the community, in the world. I just write about those things, and the challenge again for me is to make them, readable and digestible for people who don't have that experience.
That's great. Thank you.
I hope I feel like I
No, that was awesome. That was
rambling.
like you summed it up. I mean, that was like the rhetorical challenge that you kind of summed up at the end there. So that's awesome. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. I will turn off this camera now, sure, so you can get. And like I said, I will. Maybe I will. I can log us out of here. Yay! It stayed on the whole time.